Hello, I'm Hughes Roberts. I'm a Master Gardener volunteer in Haywood County, North Carolina, and an instructor for our gardening method called square foot gardening. We're filming today in the Giving Garden, which is a demonstration garden behind the Haywood County Library branch in Canton, North Carolina. I'm going to give you an introduction to my favorite gardening method, square foot gardening. What I will do is I'm going to take a traditional gardening method that people have used for centuries, and I'm going to compare that with this thing called square foot gardening, which is newer. It was developed by a gentleman who is an engineer and an efficiency expert, and I think you will see the impact of his skill when I describe that to you. Let's first talk about this traditional method called row gardening. And what you would have to do if you decided to garden but you wanted to do it as a row gardener. What is a row gardener? Well, a row gardener is a person who plants in a row, leaves about 3 feet of space, plants another row, leaves another 3 feet of space, and so forth. And there are several things that this kind of gardening requires. Number one, it requires a large amount of space. Number two, it requires developing this space for gardening. Now, if you're going to start from scratch, what you have to ask is, what tools am I going to need to prepare this garden space? I may have to go and buy an expensive tiller. I may have to pay somebody to rent a tiller. I may have to have somebody come and plow it with a tractor. If I have to buy a tiller, it's expensive, but also if you haven't tried to till a turf in your yard to prepare for a garden, you couldn't appreciate how much work that is. The other thing, or some other things about this kind of gardening, is that you typically will take seeds, and I have a seed packet here, and if you're going to plant lettuce, let's say you'll open up the seed packet, plant the whole packet, it'll come up, you'll go back and thin it, and basically you're going to take out a lot of what you planted. So it would be nice if we had a more efficient way to plant seeds and a less expensive way. When you consider the fact that you've got 3 feet between rows that have to be maintained, that means you've got to have hose, you got to have rakes, you got to have the tiller, you got to maintain this space that's not planted except for maybe weeds, and that's labor intensive. If you're in the middle of the summer like we are right now in Haywood County, when it's between 80 and 90 degrees, you're going to have to water that garden. Put a sprinkler out there, but guess what? 80% of that water is going to go somewhere other than in the row where the plants are. So you're going to waste a lot of water, potentially. Also, you're going to have to weed the rows, and that's tough work when it's 80, 90 degrees in the middle of the summer. So, in summary, that kind of approach, which can yield lots of fruit, lots of vegetables, lots of flowers, is space intensive, takes a lot of space. It's tool intensive, you need lots of tools potentially. It's water intensive, you need a lot of water. It's labor intensive all the way around. Because a row garden, properly maintained by somebody who has enough tools, enough space, enough energy, can be very high yielding. Let's talk about another approach, the square foot gardening approach. We'll contrast some of the characteristics of the square foot garden with what I've just told you about a row garden. square foot gardening approach is explained in lots of detail in this particular book, which is one of the most popular gardening books ever produced. It's called Square Foot Gardening, All New, 3rd edition. So this book has been updated multiple times, and it's full of great pictures and great illustrations. You can find this book in the library, or you can find it at other book sources. So let's draw a comparison to something I call square foot gardening, and I'm going to use a child's garden, square foot garden, as an illustration. Let's say you've decided you want to try this square foot gardening approach. Let's talk about what would be required to build one. First thing you want to do is you want to look for a space near the kitchen, hopefully, to get 6 or 8 hours or more of sun a day. And that space doesn't have to be very large. I'm going to use a very small square foot garden to illustrate some things here. This particular garden right here to my right is a children's garden. It's actually 3 feet by 3 feet in a square. And when you think about square foot gardening, you want to think about square feet. This particular little garden here, which could be Susie's or Richard's or whoever children, is going to be divided into 9 squares. And so where we need to start is with the frame. This particular frame is a 2 by 6, where 6 is the depth by 3 feet. So I need 4 of those to build the box. Now, when the box is built, the next thing I need to do is I need to put down in the bottom of the frame some weed cloth. And what that does is keep the grass from growing up into the garden. Keep in mind, we haven't done any digging, and we don't do any digging with square foot gardening with tools. So, we've got the frame, we've got the cloth. Now we need some soil. We don't dig up the soil from the garden. What we do is we put together a special mix, which is described in detail in the book, and it's 1/3 vermiculite, which is a rock substance that keeps the garden aerated. It's 1/3 peat moss, which holds moisture for the plants, and 1/3 compost. If you have a compost pile at your home, that's ideal. If you don't, you can acquire some compost elements to mix, and that makes up the other 1/3. So we have 1/3 vermiculite, 1/3 peat, 1/3 compost, and it makes a wonderful friable mix. Now, so I've got a box, I've got the soil. Now what do I do? Well, what I want to do at this point is I want to put down a grid. And this particular grid is wooden, can be made from wooden strips. This is wood lath, which I have a way that I can acquire here locally. And I want to set up this grid of 1-foot squares. Now what this means for the child is that we can plant 9 different plants, 3 times 3, for the child to learn about gardening. If we had a little larger square foot gardening, 4 feet by 4 feet, that would give us 16 different plants we could plant if we want to do that. If we want, at a point where we want to plant seed, what we do is we take a seed pack, and rather than just pour the whole seed pack out, we make some holes with our finger. We put 2 or 3 seeds in that hole, cover it up, and when that comes up, if all 3 seeds germinate, we'll take a pair of scissors and clip 2 of them off so that we only have 1 left, and that leaves space for the roots of that plant to develop. There is a chart in the book which talks about how to plant these squares. If you have a big plant like this tomato plant, we only plant one per square. If we have small plants like carrots, we might plant 16 carrot seeds per square. So the book will tell us how to do that. Now, on a day like this in the summertime, we need to water. So how do we do that? Well, we could take a sprinkler and come out here and sprinkle this whole thing, but again, 80% of that water probably would never make the plants. It would make the grass around the bed. So what we do is we have a bucket of water which we leave out in the sun to warm up. We get a cup of water and we put it right around the plant where it's really needed. Guess what? We didn't waste a lot of water. We saved a lot of water. All right, so plants do well. We harvest tomatoes here. Or we harvest carrots. When we finish harvesting the carrots, we need to plant something else in this square. So what do? Well, all we do is we go get a handful of compost and put it back in that square and mix it up with our hands, because that adds a nutrient back into that square. The vermiculite and the peat moss are fine the way they are. And all I have to do when I harvest is go back and put some compost in that particular square, and I'm ready to go for the next plant. And that way I rotate plants around my garden. So what is the contrast then that we can see between this method of gardening and the row method that I described to you? Number one, it takes much less space, maybe 20% of the space for the same yield. So we save space, and that's particularly important in the mountains where we don't have a whole lot of open space. We save labor because we don't have to operate a tiller. We don't do any tilling. We don't do any digging. So if you're an older person like me, that's an attractive concept. I'm not a tiller person anymore in my life. If we're concerned about cost, it means we don't have to buy tools. Here are my tools. I need a trowel, maybe. I rarely ever use a trowel because this soil is so easy to operate. I can do it with my hands. Don't necessarily need a trowel. I need a pair of scissors because I clip off those little seedlings. Remember, I told you that. And maybe I need a pencil to plan how I'm going to plant, but maybe not. So it's inexpensive. There are no tools to be concerned about. The water savings I mentioned to you, I don't need to put a sprinkler out. I can do this with a bucket and with a cup. The labor required to do this kind of gardening is a fraction of the labor for traditional gardens. Maybe I can go in, have a drink, and have a nap rather than being out in 80-degree heat trying to maintain a garden. Here's a special accommodation of square foot gardening. This is an elevated square foot garden. It's 4 by 4 feet with a grid. Happens to be filled with beautiful zinnias, but this is especially for someone who has trouble kneeling, and also for someone in a wheelchair, so that they can garden and appreciate flowers such as this, as well as vegetables. And this, as in the other garden that I talked about, can accommodate 9 different kinds of plants if you want to do that. Or, as has been done here, we can plant it out with the same flowers or herbs. And by the way, one thing I didn't mention before is I like to plant flowers and herbs in with vegetables for the color. I think it really can be beautiful. One of the things I didn't talk about that's an advantage of square foot gardening is the ability to plant vertically. You'll see here we planted beans vertically. They're about ready to harvest. We have watermelons that are growing up this trellis. Here's one of these watermelons. Look at that. You have a hard time keeping the kids away from those. What sunflower? Terrific sunflower right here. So vertical gardening is easily adapted to square foot gardening. There's a very inexpensive way to build a trellis, and that's covered in detail in the book. So if this piques your interest, let me make these suggestions. Number one, get the book. You can do that at the library in Canton. You can do it by ordering it online. Second thing you can do is come and visit the garden, the demonstration garden behind the library in Canton to see what we've done, because there's a lot that I haven't shown you. If you have a question about square foot gardening, check online. There's lots of information online. And if you want someone to talk to you about it, if you call the extension service and ask for someone to call you about square foot gardening, I'll be glad to do the follow-up. Thank you for watching.